band caught in a whirlwind of fame and popularity, with too much money and power, while simultaneously finding themselves starting to argue with each other and becoming jaded with the industry they were just a part of. This best describes the crossroads that Pink Floyd faced when recording began for Wish You Were Here, often regarded as one of the finest efforts of not only Pink Floyd's career, but also the entire progressive rock movement. This retro review will tell you the story about former band member Syd Barrett's unannounced visit, who recommended the album title for this record, and how the band nearly lost their 26-minute long track. Throughout this retro review, I plan to discuss the recording sessions, the notable songs, my thoughts on the album, the musical outlets' review scores, and of course my score about the album and the legacy it left on the musical industry. Without further ado, let's get into this. When looking over bands in history, we like to seek out a career-defining moment within their legacy, and for prog rock giants Pink Floyd, it is easy to determine when that moment was. Dark Side of the Moon was a monumental piece of work culminating in the collective minds of these bright musicians, and would go on to become the fourth highest selling record of all time, selling 45 million copies worldwide, and can be easily pinpointed to the band's career-defining breakthrough that turned them from an interesting English prog rock band to, of course, a group that would sell out any tour that they would embark on. But a band's career-defining moment is not necessarily a band's magnum opus. There is a quote from David Gilmour that I want to read that perfectly sums up the band's mindset before coming into the recording studio for this album, and it goes as follows. "It was a very difficult period, I have to say. All your childhood dreams had been sort of realised, and we had the biggest selling records in the world, and all the things you got into it for. The girls, the money, and the fame, and all that stuff. Everything had sort of come our way, and you had to reassess what you were in it for thereafter. And it was a pretty confusing and sort of empty time for a while." After their subsequent album release and tour, the band would begin recording sessions for their new album in January of 1975 at EMI Studio 3, which would be later renamed to Abbey Road Studios due to the Beatles' recording of the same name being recorded there. But it did not go smoothly for the band as they had hoped, and the process would drag on. This was due to a myriad of reasons. Alan Parsons, who had helped the band with Dark Side of the Moon, was requested to produce this new album, however was unable to due to commitments producing a debut album for his own band, and as such, Pink Floyd reached out to Brian Humphries to fill his spot, due to them being impressed with his works replacing a concert engineer at a live show, and also the history of having worked for the band before on their 1969 record More. Unfortunately for Brian though, he was unfamiliar with the recording tools that were used in the studio, and in one instance he even wiped all the backing vocal tracks for Shine On You Crazy Diamond, which took of course weeks to produce and would eventually have to be re-recorded. On top of this, both Roger Waters and Richard Wright were undergoing messy divorces at this time, and this would lead to Richard becoming very absent during the recording sessions, adding to the strain of this process and making it a very tense environment. After 6 grueling months of recording, which saw the band working 4 days a week from the hours of 2:30 in the afternoon until very late in the evenings, the band had eventually put together the album, even resorting to producing it themselves, perhaps due to the fact that they liked the sound that they were making, but also more than likely is that they knew the equipment better and were more attuned to it than Brian was. So, eventually the album was released. Now, out of the 5 possible options that I have to mention, of course, of what songs are noteworthy or not, I have decided to only mention 4, because I'll consider Shine On as one whole song. When you add up both parts of this track, it has a 26-minute duration, and according to most, you would say that the reason that this song was split up in the first place was because of what vinyl's limitations were at the time. You see, one side could only contain a certain amount of minutes, and with this song as its entire duration, it just wouldn't fit on one side. However, this song wasn't meant to be as long as it was at the very beginning. Originally, this song was only meant to be 1 track. But let's not get ahead of ourselves here just yet. As previously mentioned, the initial recording sessions were slow to start, but during one particular little warm-up exercise, David was doing, of course, he performed a little 4-note guitar lick that caught the attention of Roger, and he suggested on working on it. This kickstarted the creative gears which formed as an idea to write this long epic sprawling piece similar to Echoes, except it would be an ode to their past guitarist Syd Barrett, and even take cues from their past songs like Raving and Drooling. It would be given the working title of Shine On in homage to Syd, who had been unceremoniously fired from the band in 1968 after issues with drug use and possibly suffering from schizophrenia, which rendered him unable to perform in live settings. This song was actually debuted live a full year before the album's release, as the band wanted to hear it in a live setting and work on any flaws that they thought it had before putting it out there in its final product. Going back a few years, David Gilmour first joined the band to take on guitar duties for Syd, even recording one album together, A Saucer Full of Secrets, but he eventually replaced him full time in the end. And after Syd was fired from the band, no one really heard from him for quite some time. Now, this next part is rather well known in the community, but I'm just going to say it anyway for those who aren't aware, because it is an odd twist of fate, I guess you could say, and is an important moment for the band and this song. During the recording of the album, people would regularly walk into the studio a little bit and check on the band, which is surprising to hear these days, but was somewhat normal back in the day. And one day, this individual walked in and just watched the band for a couple of minutes. Except he was giving off these unusual vibes, kind of skulking in the corner if you will. After a while the band approached this individual and were shocked to learn that it was Syd Barrett himself, except he had shaved all the head off his hair, even his eyebrows, and had gained a lot of weight. For context, here is a photo of him in 1968, and here is a photo of him in 1975 from the exact moment that I am talking about. Roger Waters was reportedly so shocked by his appearance, he fell to his knees and started to weep. This was a friend of his that he had not seen since those turn of events back in 1968, now looking unrecognisable and in shambles the last time he had seen him. Roger apparently said nothing to Syd during this encounter, but did note that it left a deep and profound experience on him. It was like seeing a ghost or a mad genius, he would later mention in an interview after the ordeal. The band would play some of the music that they were recording on this album for Syd, in particular the song Shine On, which is a bit of an odd experience considering the song was about himself. But he had very little to say about this experience, just kind of standing there listening. In fact, the only quote that I could find during his interaction with the band was stating that it sounded a bit old. The band would even try to incorporate him on the record by getting him to play a little bit of guitar work or maybe sing, but he would not participate in any way, shape or form. After a small amount of time had passed and discussions, the band agreed to take Syd out to a party that night. However, he would not attend in the end, and this was the last interaction the band had with him until his passing some 30 years later, with the exception of Roger Waters, who bumped into him in a shopping centre during the mid-80s. With this surprise visitor, it reinvigorated the band as they would record this song multiple times before getting it right. Dick Perry was brought on to play sax for this song, returning to his role after he had done the songs for Us and Them and Money on the album prior. This was also one of the last songs that Richard Wright got a writing credit for while with the band, before he would eventually be fired by Roger Waters during the recording sessions for The War. Roger suggested to Gilmour that they should split this song up in two, but David was against the idea. Eventually the band voted on this, but David lost the vote 3-1 in favour of the decision, and the song would eventually be renamed Shine On You Crazy Diamond, with its acronym as a reference to Syd Barrett. This song is very simple at its core. It's about the record industry and its common theme on how it can grind musicians down due to the constant touring, the lifestyle, and eventually how music would become hollow. It even mentions the executives a few times on this song. This tune was also covered by Shadows Fall in 2003, which I find quite interesting as it's not one of the most iconic songs off the album, but it was a great choice for them as they made it a much more heavier sound akin to their own styles. Another interesting fact surrounding this song is how it saw the introduction of cartoonist Gerald Scarfe, who would create a video for this song that was rarely played except for a few times at live performances. Gerald, who at the time was drawing caricatures for the Daily Express newspaper, might be remembered most fondly outside of Pink Floyd's fan base for creating the opening and closing sequences for the British sitcom Yes, Minister. He is more commonly known, however, in the Pink Floyd community as the guy who drew the artwork for The Wall and its subsequent movie that would feature Bob Geldof in 1982. How about that for some song facts? Surprisingly, this was the only single released off the album, but given the choice between a slow acoustic ballad about how time fades away and we grow old, or a 26-minute long prog rock epic, I think their choices were very limited. In a surprise to no one who knows the band, this was not their most famous song off the album, although it is one of the few in the band's discography to feature a guest lead vocalist, with legendary folk singer Roy Harper lending us his pipes for this tune after Roger Waters tore his vocals to shreds during some live performances. The song is also written from the perspective of how record execs perceive their talent as cash cows, trying to win them over with tall tales of riding the gravy train and celebrating with cigars. It is written from the band's perspective as they started becoming wary of their success and how certain assholes would start to gravitate towards them and treat the band. This is also made rather ironic because of Roy Harper's initial response to his participation on the track, as he wasn't originally credited on the album and wouldn't be so for some 15 years, depending on which variant of the record you owned at the time. He had also requested tickets to the Lord's Cricket Grounds for life, but instead was only paid a few £100 for his time, and ended up hiring a lawyer to resolve this issue in a self-fulfilling prophecy to the song and what it represents regarding the dirty music industry. Many musicians have covered this song, ranging from Government Mule to Primus, and even Dream Theater using a riff for their song Peruvian Skies during a live performance, but the version that I am most familiar with was done by Foo Fighters featuring Brian May, which was used on the Mission Impossible 2 soundtrack, which was an influential album to me in my youth. In fact, I heard this cover version before I heard the original piece and thought it was one of the best tracks off that album. So imagine the look of surprise on my face when I played the Wish You Were Here album for the first time and this song came up. And then it dawned on me where the original had come from. I'll tell you, if YouTube was around back in 2001, my reaction video would have been used as a thumbnail to those who were discovering Pink Floyd for the first time in their lives. Okay, we have reached the title track at last, and perhaps the most covered song to exist outside of Wonderwall by Oasis, and for good reason too. Wish You Were Here focuses on being isolated in a world of fame while simultaneously striving for past lives, particularly referring to Syd Barrett once again, another common thread that appears on the album. This song is actually one of the few where both Waters and Gilmour really work together here, as the original was a much more fast-paced sounding affair until Waters suggested slowing it down and turning it into an acoustic piece, while incorporating a poem that he had written for Syd into the lyrics. In fact, in the years that follow, when Roger Waters left Pink Floyd after bitter infighting, particularly with David Gilmour, he mostly avoided performing anything that he wrote with David Gilmour, with only one exception. This song is the exception, as it resonated deeply with him. And speaking of David Gilmour, there has been a long-standing rumour that the cough heard at the start of this song, along with the radio chatter, was Gilmour's smoker's cough, and was meant as a symbolic way to show that he had quit this habit. This mythos is not true, and was most likely coined up because of a statement that he made about the song's intro.
Helped you quit smoking after you heard yourself coughing in the background of the song.
Let me digress a tiny bit. I never smoked.
You never smoked?
No, I mean, no, I've said before that I've never really smoked. Mind you, when the internet comes along, one of my kids came up to me standing with Paul McCartney, and I had a great big joint in my hand.
He said,
She said, Dad, you say you didn't smoke.
In an interesting turn of events, the Goo Goo Dolls actually performed a live version of this song with Limp Bizkit in 2001 for a tribute to the Heroes telethon dedicated to the victims of the 9/11 attacks.
Well, what a lost soul swimming in a fishbowl year after.
I say interesting because, of course, Limp Bizkit were on the Mission Impossible 2 soundtrack along with Foo Fighters and Brian May and their cover of Have a Cigar. But of course the list of covers hardly stops there. So here is a few others who have covered this song. Ultimately, this track was chosen to become the title piece at the recommendation of their longtime artwork designer and the artist who did the Dark Side of the Moon album cover, Storm Thurgeson, who first recommended it to the band after initial discussions on their photo shoot for the album's iconic cover. While I was editing this video, news actually came through that the stuntman who was on the front album cover actually passed away the day before I was about to do this video. So I just want to give a shout out to the stuntman, Ronnie Rondell, who was the man who was set on fire for the photo shoot. May he rock in peace for his iconic imagery on this album. Well, I think this is one of the greatest prog rock records ever. After all, I just mentioned the entire album under the notable songs section of this review. Also, while I'm on it, we have mentioned Storm Thurgerson before, so it only makes sense, I guess, to talk about the front cover, which hid layers to its art, as the original vinyl contained a black shrink wrap with two hands shaking above the design, symbolizing the handshake deal amongst the upper management types. Once this is peeled back, we get that iconic artwork with the man on fire shaking another man's hand in the Warner Brothers studio located in California, symbolizing how someone is getting burned over their deal. And even the corner of the image shows a little bit of burn damage here. I'll never forget picking up this CD for the first time and just my attention being transfixed to the cover. It was just so bizarre and vibrantly coloured. It was confusing. The other aspect, of course, was this was a band whose name I knew, but only knew by name at this very point in time, because the only song I had heard by them was Money at this stage in my life. But they were highly regarded by my dad, so I got this CD while on holidays and put it on in my Discman immediately, placing those headphones over my ears, and pure magic and ecstasy filled me as those first few notes played out from Shine On You Crazy Diamond. And I'm only talking about the saxophone intro at this point. Gilmour's sudden lone guitar ringing out when it came time is just chills, literal chills every time I hear it. I don't think I can quite understate this moment in time. Then Welcome to the Machine played out with its sparse sound effects and trippy undertones and left me perplexed as to just what I was hearing. But I wanted more. Have a Cigar follows, which made me realise what the original actually sounded like when compared to the version that I heard by Foo Fighters and Brian May, and I realised just how insanely good this piece was. Then the loneliness of Wish You Were Here rang out through my headphones, hauntingly echoing that odd time in your life when you're a teenager and just wishing to isolate yourself. While this song hit differently at the time back then compared to now after being served a hard dose of reality with real life, it does well to be a timeless piece that can mean so many different things to so many people. And of course, Shine On You Crazy Diamond Part 2 just rounded out the whole experience, just tying it all together like a neat little package. And after the album finished, I immediately pressed play again for a second playthrough. Here I was glued to my headphones by what I had just heard, and it couldn't be more starkly different to anything that I was listening to at this time in my life. I mean, I was young, but my musical taste was very limited at this point, to just bands like Metallica, Silverchair, Powderfinger, Limp Bizkit, Korn, or Slipknot. Not really much else. But then this album came and opened up my perception to the other musical genres that existed, serving as my introduction to the prog rock field as a whole. Now, people have said that this album is more of a David Gilmour record, and I've always considered this to be true, but not to the extent that The Wall is Roger Waters' baby. I feel like this album is the first time he expressed more of his ideas with more confidence. Now, in his solo efforts and future works with Pink Floyd post Waters, it seems to ring true as well. Richard Wright created some great compositions within, and while the rhythm sections of Waters and Nick acts as, of course, the glue for this record, it takes quite a bit of a backseat, allowing for Gilmour to showcase his insanely talented guitar skills and signature tone. Essentially, this album became a gateway for me as I would start listening to more and more of Pink Floyd's works, and eventually started to check out other bands such as Yes, Rush, Genesis, Porcupine Tree, Dream Theater, Tool, and Opeth. All bands that I cherish and absolutely love for their music. But all of these adventures can be traced back to that one moment in my life when I picked up this album and gave it a spin on my Walkman some 20 plus years ago. In other words, this record had an extremely profound effect on my musical taste to date, and this album is easily one of those desert island records I would take with me. Surprisingly, the album was initially met with mixed reviews upon its release, with Rolling Stone magazine stating the album was devoid of their sincere passion for their art. Melody makers would write up stating, from whichever direction one approaches, Wish You Were Here it still sounds unconvincing in its ponderous sincerity and displays a critical lack of imagination in all departments. Robert Christgau was also dismissive of the album, but was a lot more kinder. In retrospect, all musical outlets would quickly change their tunes and sing its praises as it fastly became a runaway success, even finding itself on the list of 500 greatest albums of all times in future publications of the Rolling Stones magazine. Current scores for the record are near perfection, with AllMusic given a score of 5 out of 5, Blender given a score of 5 out of 5, Christgau's Record Guide given a lowest score of A-, Encyclopedia of Popular Music given a 5 out of 5, The Great Rock and Roll Discography given a score of 10 out of 10, Music Hound given a score of 5 out of 5, Pitchfork given a 10 out of 10, The Record Collector given a 5 out of 5, The Rolling Stone Album Guide given a 5 out of 5, and Tom Hall on the web giving it an A. Meanwhile, over at rachelmusic.com, this album sits at a score of 4.35 from over 78,000 reviews. I can't emphasize just how impressive that score is on this platform. It's notoriously difficult for any record to get above a score of 4, and to prove just how good of a score this album is, it is the 4th highest scoring album of all time on their platform, only beaten by Radiohead's In Rainbows and OK Computer, and Kendrick Lamar's To Pimp a Butterfly. For reference, Dark Side of the Moon is sitting at the 10th position, so I think it's safe to say that most people prefer this record over their most iconic work. As for me, well, it's going to be a perfect score of 15 million chilies on the spicy scale, with every single second on this album being my favourite part. There is just no bad tracks off this album, and it must be played from start to finish every time. First time perfect score on the series, people. I have wanted to give this score for so long because there are perhaps only 3 albums that I would give this score to. Before I jump into the legacy that this album made on the music scene, I just wanted to tell you about the legacy this album left upon me when I first heard it back in 2003. This is one of 5 albums that has had a profound effect on me, and it's easily the one that has left the biggest impact. I'd like to believe that some old Pink Floyd fans out there are smiling at the notion that some 25 years after the fact this album came out, it can still have such an impact on people's musical views, and I have no doubt that Wish You Were Here will continue to do so even 50 years later. I guess that's my personal legacy when it comes to this record, but it is evident that I am not the only one either, as many other musicians absolutely adore this album. It isn't just a confirmed fact, but rather that this album serves as the foundation for the entire prog rock genre, from a band that is synonymous to this style of music and even to outside of it. The tracks on this album have been covered or sampled by too many artists to mention, especially if we listed all the times it was done live, but perhaps the most famous covers have been done by bands such as Census Fall, Queensryche, Finger 11, Wyclef Jean, Primus, 1-2, Government Mule, Fiddler, Mobb Deep, and my personal favourite of course, which was Foo Fighters with Brian May. In fact, the album would be performed in its entirety by a tribute band featuring artists such as Rick Wakeman, Ian Pace, Joe Satriani, Bootsy Collins, and Steve Stevens, amongst others. And during my research to find out which bands would do cover versions of these songs, I also found out there is another band out there that was called Pink Floyd, which was something that I considered doing many years ago under the very same name. Even bands like Porcupine Tree would show their love for Pink Floyd in their early days, and this is perfectly shown on the album The Sky Moves Sideways, which has a title track that goes in excess of 30 minutes in length and is separated into 2 sections placed at the beginning and the end of the album. Steven Wilson has even worked alongside Pink Floyd to reproduce some of their works. For me, I would say that this album is my Desert Island album. This is the one I could listen to for years on end without being tired of it. It is just perfect. If you've enjoyed this content, make sure to smash that like button, subscribe to us, and stay notified for future music-related content because it keeps our manager happy at the end of the day. We are also on Discord, Instagram, Facebook, and all those other social platforms if you want to check us out. As always, people, you have a great day and stay spicy.